Welcome to Voice by Vinexposium, where the global wine and spirit community shares insights, stories, and expertise. Voice is your platform, your stories, and your voice.
Hello, I'm Anne Burchett, wine marketing and communication specialist, and this is Voice by Vinexposium. Voice by Vinexposium deals with the topics that matter in the wine and spirit world. Today I'm talking to Mikk Parre, ASI Best Sommelier of Europe, Africa and the Middle East in 2024. Congratulations once more. Michael Tischler-Zimmermann, Managing Director of Österreichische Traditionsweingüter, and Romané Basset, co-founding trustee and head of operations at the Gérard Basset Foundation.
Thank you, Anne.
Good morning, and
Morning.
thank you for joining me.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Sommelier, a difficult job, requiring an arduous training, long antisocial working hours, a prestigious job title, a vocation, an exclusive club. What exactly does a sommelier do? Who are the sommeliers of the future? And how can the industry best support them? These are the topics we're going to address today, and we'll start with you, Mikk. Can you tell us, what is the role of a sommelier in 2025?
Thanks for having me. We're starting with a pretty big question, aren't we? I think that what a sommelier is, it's developing and changing in time all the time. It's getting much more diverse than it used to be. I think the time of the sommelier as just a guy who picks a wine and pours it out is quite over. Sommeliers do a lot of different aspects. Often they're spokespeople, they're representatives of their establishments, they're even like ambassadors and so forth. So this is definitely a key aspect. But I think overall, as the times are getting quite diverse in terms of wine lists and wine selection, I think the most important thing that a sommelier is in 2025 is like a guide and a pathfinder to people. It's not just about picking the right vintage of Bordeaux for your guests, but you're dealing with low intervention natural wines which need to be addressed to people in a specific way and so forth. So I think this is what a sommelier is at core in 2025 is a guide and a pathfinder, at least in my opinion.
A guide and a pathfinder. I like that very much. Would you comment on that?
Well, I wouldn't have used the words guide and pathfinder, but I agree very much with the sentiment. I think the word I would have used was a demystifier, because I suppose there are so many specificities of the role of a sommelier that to your point, it's getting more and more diverse. It's hard, if we go into them, we'll be here until tomorrow. But
no, please do.
But I would say, in broad, what I see as the sommelier's role is to demystify this sort of complex, vast topic that is wine and help people, predominantly in the restaurant, but also in wine bars and other establishments, help them to make the choice that will bring them the most pleasure, whatever that may be, whether that may be a fine wine, whether that may be a natural wine, a no intervention wine, whether that might be, something really simple, but so long as it's something which gives them pleasure and enhances their enjoyment of their experience dining or wherever they may be. For me, I think that approach where it's focusing on the guest and guiding them, helping them find the path they want to take is essential.
So, a pleasure enhancer. That's an interesting concept.
Not quite. Don't quote that. But no, not
too late.
I suppose in many ways, yes. Though in terms of, because I think also nowadays there's so much focus on the experiential. There's so much focus upon when one goes out for a meal. It's so much more than the sum of its parts. It's the joy that brings from the beautiful food, the lovely wine, the wonderful company, and the sommelier is an integral cog within that machine.
I was teasing you, but I like that very much, this idea of bringing something extra to the experience, an added value, but in much nicer term. Would you concur with that?
Yeah, and I wanted to maybe add overcoming the transitional barriers also, because I think what we see is a generation coming up that is maybe not necessarily exposed to drinking wine or has a vast abundance of pleasures available. And then you need to make it accessible, and you need someone to guide you overcome that barrier that might be there, because it might seem elitist, it might seem inaccessible, it might seem too complicated. But if you have someone guiding you and actually make it accessible also, in terms of buy the glass offer, or just maybe open a bottle and have you share or taste something, I think that is, at least for the younger generation, also a very important role that sommeliers will step into and do step into.
Yeah. So to add to this definition, there are restaurants, unfortunately, that do not employ a sommelier. What would be the added value, between a restaurant without a sommelier and a restaurant or a group of restaurants with a sommelier? What would be the major difference in terms of consumer experience? Be as mean as you want to be.
No, I think even as far as consumer experience, I think it's one thing, but I think what a sommelier does for the establishment itself, for the restaurant and wine bar, I think that is often like most overlooked part, like the key aspect, like driving the business part, or the guy who actually brings in money in that sense. Because your sommelier's role, you can be the guide and the pathfinder, and however you want to call the person who guides them around. But in the end, for business, you're the guy who makes the things go around. You will be the guy who is making deals, finding the appropriate wines for those positions, working around with Excel, all sorts of this kind of non-glamorous thing, which is actually, I think, the key value that a sommelier can add to any establishment, regardless of its essence.
I would add, you're also a host. You're
always
sometimes the face that is being seen at the table most often, and then hosting the table, right? And so making it pleasurable for the whole table to be there.
So it's interesting because we go from a role which is almost wishy-washy, the pleasure enhancer, to a shrewd business operator who's got to understand figures. I think this is a very good combination, and one that is sometimes woefully misunderstood, because you need both. You need to be equally charming, but also be good with figures. Would you agree with that?
Completely agree. You need to have, the whole package in that sense, but you kind of need that. You need to be the entertainer for the people. You need to be the host, as we said earlier, and you need to have the, brain and the stability to work with a computer behind the scenes as well. So,
but it's quite telling. I think there's sort of become more of a recognition of that, because I've noticed from looking at, say, the ASI competitions, increasingly I notice there are more and more questions which are business focused. So traditionally it's very much the scenarios you're speaking, I don't need to tell you this, you know very well, but it's speaking to a client, but then every now and then you're speaking to your F&B manager, and they're asking you, should you put this wine on your list? And they're not interested in the romantic descriptions of where the wine comes from. They're interested in what's the margin on it, how much volume are we going to put out, can we sell it by the glass, can we put it in the mini bars? It's very good, I think, that there's a recognition, as you said, of the multifacetedness of it, and that it's, while maybe many of us went to the more sort of glamorous and the more sort of front-facing part of it, as you say, there's much more to it.
Much more depth. I think it's interesting because, in a way, the sommelier role echoes very much the job of being a wine producer nowadays. Wine producers, all they needed to do in the good old days is produce good wine. Now they need to be social media whiz, good at marketing, good at distribution, too many skills, actually. But I feel like the sommelier role has evolved quite considerably and now encompasses so many strands. Is that something you felt, especially when you've been preparing for the competition?
Definitely, you can see that world, expanding quite rapidly. It starts from the fact that the wine world is not about five countries and 10 grapes anymore, but the entire world is here, and the same goes for the aspects and what your employer asks of you, what the customers ask of you. It's nice to be this kind of pocket handbook or Google at the side to push out interesting facts, but it's a lot more. So I completely agree.
So what skills, if someone came to you and said, thinking about, entering the profession, What would you say are the essential skills for this person to have to become a good sommelier? Not a bad one.
Not a bad one. Yeah, in my opinion, there are two key factors to that. One that we cannot get around is passion. This is something that's, number one. It's such a diverse and crazy world to get into in the first place. With it's changing all the time. The amount of information and knowledge you need to have it's pretty crazy. So you need to have that passion and drive to really go into it and to be a good sommelier. You can read about wine and all sorts of stuff, but to actually go into it and channel what it is about, that's what you need passion about. And another thing that I also find quite key is the not just about passion, but like humanity in that sense. Something that you can read all the books you want, but there's this core essence. I think to make a great sommelier is something that you cannot really have unless you're born with it. It's the humanity, the approachability, and the ability to just to be like one of the guys. If you look at all basically more or less all the top sommeliers in the world, all the world champions, all of them, they're all these kind of humble, down-to-earth guys, and you can see that in the sommelier and wine world in general, because these kind of people, it's this kind of core thing that all those top sommeliers have. They're not this kind of stuck-up, snobbish people. They're actually human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of humanity, lots of approachability.
I remember I would entirely agree with that, and I've heard exactly the same sentiment expressed, but in a slightly different way. It was an interview that Dad did, years ago now, and the interviewer says to him, what does a sommelier need? And my dad said, the first thing is a sommelier must love people. And you hear the interviewer say, not the wine, but people. He says, people. And I think that's entirely right, because that humanity, not only does that extend to interaction with guests, working within a team, which is also another essential part of the sommelier, is being a team player and in many cases a team leader. But to what you were saying about passion, and as I think, if you walk around the halls at Vinexpo demonstrates, you have the bottles,
Wine
and
Paris.
then, Wine Paris, apologies. As walking around the halls at Wine Paris demonstrates, you have the stands with the bottles, and then immediately behind every one of them, you have a human face. You have someone who makes that wine, represents that wine, is passionate. And I think, as you said, the sommelier tapping into the human behind the bottle and bringing that through has immense value.
Yes.
And it's essential.
I think that's a very valid point. You were just about to comment on that.
And I just wanted to resonate on this humbleness that I also experience with the best people that are out there, that don't give me the feeling I'm in the wrong place.
Yeah.
And don't embarrass me because I might not know enough, So I experience them as the most lovable and likable people. And they manage to embrace the diversity that is out there without neglecting. Even though you don't like every wine, which is fine, but you embrace it as part of the diversity.
Yeah.
And you're still able to communicate about it professionally. You're still able to do your job with what you're supposed to do with that wine.
Yeah.
Right?
And you may not even like every single client.
Yeah, could also happen.
It's about looking the good aspects about anything. It doesn't matter if it's a wine you don't like or people you don't like. You're always looking at the positive aspects.
Yeah, and doing a professional job.
Meanwhile, yes.
So we've talked about being human. Well, that leads on to the next question. Everybody's talking about artificial intelligence at the moment. And the role of artificial intelligence, will it replace some of the jobs we know today? And sommelier is one of these jobs where some people will tell you that tomorrow we'll have robots in restaurant or little guides replacing that human touch. What's your view on that? Do you feel threatened?
No, not the least bit, I would say.
It's good.
Yes, I think.
Correct answer.
I think it's more or less like it can't really replace a sommelier in all aspects. It can replace some parts of a sommelier. For example, we're talking about this kind of the boring behind-the-scenes menial labor that a sommelier also has to do that other people don't really see. So this is a lot of the part that an AI possibly can replace. You have to go through immense amounts of information, for example. AI can help you do that in one click of a button.
Yeah.
It can be better than, even at business calculations and stuff like that. AI can do that in a second, so it will leave you time to do the more important things. But it can never replace, in my opinion, like the theatrics and then, as we said earlier, the human part. That's what people expect in a high-end establishment, for you to interact, to entertain them in a sense.
Yes.
So I think that's one part that a sommelier that an AI really cannot replace.
But it can help you. That's very interesting. You think it can make you more efficient and do some jobs. Can you give us an example, a practical example of one of the job where it can help?
I don't know how it is. I guess it's a little bit different in many countries, but often if you're faced with the task of choosing wines for your next wine list or wine list updates, we're faced with these hundreds of page lists of Excel sheets filled with, there's hundreds of different Rieslings or something. It will help you just with a click of a button. It will help you filter out your necessary things.
Yes.
Just, you can even help it along in a sense, like give it an idea that, I want a nice crisp Riesling from this list. Make me a selection of 10 that you would find, and it will do it in a click of a button. Of course, you as a sommelier will have to actually double check and do all the work, but it will help you in that sense. It's just out of the blue example. Most sommeliers probably will not do it exactly like this. They want that personal approach, but that's the way that an AI can help you.
Yeah.
In a very simple place, it can possibly replace a sommelier in a casual establishment where
Yes.
the requirement of a sommelier would be in question, perhaps in the first place. But it can make a very basic wine list for you, again, in a click of a button. But I think it's just a combination of sommelier plus AI. I think sommeliers these days should already be utilizing AI in a sense to help make their work easier and save more time for the more important things.
Michael, anything to add on that? Any use of AI that you
I
can
could
see?
think of stock management, calculations, sometimes even maybe descriptions, If you know your backgrounds, it can help,
Yeah.
But it's good in finding facts and stating facts.
But
that's what it's good at.
that does, in turn, put the onus on the producer to put in the right information in the material that's going to be investigated by AI, doesn't it? So it's sort
Only
of
as good
shift.
as it's been taught. Yeah.
Yeah. So it means that, for example, in your previous role, you would have to make sure that all the wines that you push at have the right information next to them.
Correct information is key. I
Yeah.
mean, also in the work that we do nowadays, if you don't get the correct information, you will never be able to do your job.
Yeah.
So obviously we're trying to make it as accessible as possible and to provide that orientation also to the sommeliers that they can follow a certain grid in their minds and say, okay, this is what I can rely on, this is what I can remember, basically, and then there's add-on information, but we always need to make sure it's absolutely accurate and we need to do our homework. Yeah, for sure.
Can you think of other example, Romané?
In terms of what AI can help us sommelier with, no, I think you two have covered it far better and in all completeness, I think. I think in terms of, is there a risk of AI replacing sommelier? I don't think so. I completely agree with you because, again, it can never have that humanity. But also there is an argument, say, if we talk in the realm of food and wine pairing, there are the logical food and wine pairings, which an AI would be able to be taught. But there's oftentimes pairings which on paper make no sense but work. And I think a human will always be able to find those and then explain those and really sort of convey those to a guest in a restaurant in a way that an AI never could.
It's a very good example because I'm thinking back to Sunday at the Vedor ceremony when Chateau d'Yquem was served with oysters. I'm not sure that AI would have been able to spot that match because even the guests who were all wine professional were going, "Oh, that's really interesting," but everybody loved it. So, and that's a human touch. Absolutely. So that's really good. Slightly controversial question. I remember reading, don't frown, don't worry.
Everyone sits up in their seats.
No, it's a bit of a jokey question, actually. I remember when reading your father's memoir, he had a very unique, self-deprecating sense of humour, and he was saying that just being French was his sort of gateway into the profession. And I could relate to that because being French, moving to another country, same thing, people assume you know about wine, and you think, well, they don't know, I don't know, but never mind. So would you say, the archetypical sommelier used to be French, quite snooty. That's obviously a thing of the past, but do you think they are nationality that have the edge in terms of becoming good sommelier? Does being French still helps? Or can anyone from any background become a top sommelier?
I think for me, it would definitely be anyone from any background can always have the capability of becoming a top sommelier, because it's been very illuminating working with the foundation. I remember speaking to one of our scholars who is from Nigeria originally, and she said one of the big problems she found when she lives in the UK now is the lexicon we have for tasting in the UK, the ingredients and the flavours she would associate with wine were completely different. And that is true, I think, in all different regions of the world. So it stands to reason that people coming from different backgrounds across different parts of the world will have those different references, which then they can convey in their own unique way to guests. And, maybe it might give them the edge with certain cuisines or certain styles of presentation or service. So I honestly believe that, the wine knowledge, that can always be learned if you have the passion, to the point we made earlier. But the essential characteristic is that humanity again, and, people from all walks of life across every country on earth can have that humanity. So I don't think there's any restriction based upon where you come from. And of course there are, there are associations with certain nationalities, and it stands to reason. If you are in a sort of traditional classic French restaurant with a very classically French wine list, having a French sommelier who's done their training in France, naturally that is going to be probably very useful for that restaurant. But does that mean that another sommelier from somewhere else could come in to that restaurant and not do as good a job? No, I don't think so. I think it's not a determining factor.
I think that's very good news. Would you? Yes.
Sorry, if I may add to this, because
Absolutely.
I would absolutely support this argument, and that it's possible for everyone. One thing is accessibility of wines, and I think that is something, because we haven't spoken about competitions yet, interestingly.
Not yet.
But when it comes to competition and knowledge, you need accessibility to wine.
Yes.
Right? And having wine accessible in France is easy. Having wine accessible in other countries is far more difficult. And I think that is the important role that generic bodies and associations like us come in and actually support people in experiencing the wines and have them come to the country, etc., and really enable them to experience it and to learn and to taste. So I would say yes, everyone can, but the prerequisites are different, and there's a gap to be filled by organizations and bodies to support it,
to push
it, and to really bring the whole trade forward.
I think that's a very valid point, because the way I look at it, I've never been a sommelier, I've been a waitress, but that's where it stops. When you look at certain country, I've got a friend in Greece who's a big wine fan, but in Greece, he can only access a certain range of wine. And in the UK, we don't realize how lucky we are. We pay a fortune for it, but we can have literally any wine under the sun. Another element is the language of wine, the name of wine. When you grow up in a wine-producing country, be it France, Spain, Portugal, the States, you have a knowledge of the geography, of the pronunciation of certain terms, that is instinctive, because that's where you grew up. And I look at, for example, Japanese wine professional. They have so much more to learn because they don't have that innate knowledge of some of the classic wine region that come through geography lesson when you were at primary school. How was it for you? How did you get into wine? How did you absorb all these vast knowledge?
I would actually put a little bit of a spin on what you were saying earlier about, the question started with, is the French sommelier still like the quintessential sommelier? I would actually say that these days there might actually be a little bit of a disadvantage, for example, to being from a big wine producing country, for example, being French or being Spanish, compared to someone coming from, for example, like me, who comes from a country that is not a wine producing country. Because, if you're French, you grew up with French wines. If you're Spanish, you grew up with Spanish wines. Whereas we, for example, in Northern Europe, we grow up with everything on an equal level. So, I've heard about, for example, in the wine schools of Austria, it's, for example, a 3-year wine school. The first 2 years, you're focused mostly on Austrian wines. And then the third year, oh, by the way, there's wines from other countries as well. Whereas for us, it starts on an even playing level. So I think this actually offers maybe a little bit of an advantage to people coming from, regions or countries where you don't have your local wine that you're growing up with. So you're kind of, both your taste profile and your understanding of the wines is maybe a little bit more global and maybe a little bit more easier to grasp the big picture in its own.
I think that's a very, very good point, because inevitably, when you grow up in a certain culture of wine, these will be your pillars, what you build on, whereas you come at it from a completely neutral point of view. So your internal computer can say, well, I'm happy to recommend this or that, it doesn't matter. And also people will have less expectation of you pushing a certain type of wine. Another point you made about that, which I think was very good, was a repertoire of flavors and descriptors. As we're trying to acquire new customers, new wine drinkers, we need to be able to match different cuisine and understand different approach to cooking. And I think to have sommeliers who come from different cultures, they can bring all this knowledge with them and be able to communicate more effectively in a less possible classical way. Is that something you feel is a requisite when you try to match wine with food which is more modern, a bit more out there?
I think having a diverse background helps definitely, but it's all about where you're at. We were talking about, if you're in a classic French restaurant, it might be perhaps best to stick with, classic French wine and food in that sense. So otherwise, but we were talking about this, more global cuisine these days as well. You can see a lot of fusion restaurants. So this is the place where sommeliers can really shine, in a sense. They can play around with crazy things. You can pair a classic French dish with a Japanese wine, for example, or just kind of experiment and explore. I think that's definitely one of the key aspects that a sommelier loves about their job. So yeah.
And I mean, we're talking about wine because obviously that is the root of the sommelier profession, but really sommeliers don't just pair wine. There's a vast array of beverages that a sommelier can choose to play with to tie in with that. And I think another factor which I think ties into what we've said about, where one comes from and how that affects how you think about wine. So, as you said, you've got a very neutral view of wines from all over the world because not growing up in a winemaking country, whereas in Austria that might be trickier to come by. I think one of the key sort of greatest assets of Sommelier is that it's such a community. Mm-hmm. And so you get this exchange across those different cultures and different backgrounds. So, being at an ASI international competition, you've got sommeliers from, if it's the World Championships, more than 60 countries across the globe. All these somms will have different backgrounds, different experiences, many of whom, indeed, Dad is a good example, born in France, made his career in the UK and represented the UK in the competitions. You can then exchange those perspectives and maybe gain new insights through that as well. So yes. I think that's going back to maybe one of the original roots of the question about, is background a determining factor on whether you can become a great sommelier? Again, I don't think it is, but I do think having a variety of backgrounds within the sommelier trade is very helpful because of the communal aspect and because of the great level of exchange that takes place.
You've just stolen my next question.
Oh, sorry.
It's very upsetting.
I do apologise.
That's absolutely fine. No, I think it's really interesting because I feel that through the work of your foundation, through other organization, the wine trade is opening up. The wine trade is looking, again, because our consumer basis is shrinking. We need new consumers, and new consumers mean new influencers, new people who can spread the good word. And I think that diversity is really, really important. So how diverse, I mean, you're a good example of coming from a northern country that was not a wine-producing country, but how actually diverse is the sommelier world today, both in terms of nationalities and in terms of gender?
I mean, it's a good question. It's a very broad question. I think fundamentally the question of how diverse it is, how diverse is it, is one that is not wholly answerable, but maybe the question should be something along the lines of, how accessible is it? How much potential does it have to attract a wide variety of people? And I think the answer is, it depends where one is. If one is somewhere like the UK where wine education is relatively sort of easy to come by. A lot of
Yes.
the great wine education institutions are based in the UK. We have, as you said, we get wines from all across the world
Yes.
in the UK at varying degrees of expense. It possibly is more accessible in the UK than it might be, say, in Brazil, for example, where price fluctuations and trying to find wines from across the world to import could be very challenging. So the answer, I think, would be, again, it's unanswerable. Is the sommelier industry diverse? Because it would have to necessitate a sweeping statement. But I think, can it be made more accessible, and should it be
Yes.
made more accessible? The answer would be a resounding yes, because going back to what we were saying earlier, it just helps bring in those new perspectives, bring in different ways of thinking, which then can appeal to new and more varied consumers.
Yes. So what's your view on that? What's your perception as a sommelier?
I completely agree in that sense. But there are places in the world, as you said, which are in a more advantageous position. Like in the UK, you can have everything literally that exists whereas in a small country, for example, the market itself sets its limits. For example, we might have a broad selection of things, but there is a narrow selection within, for example, a country or a region or something. We might not have all the top names in the world because there's just not a big enough market to sell everything in that sense. So this definitely comes into play. And you mentioned gender early as well in your question, like how diverse is in that sense. I would think it's getting much more diverse as time goes on. You can see a lot of the top sommeliers, both in competitions and in the head sommeliers of top restaurants in the world. They're not, your middle-aged men with a bow tie anymore.
Yeah.
You can have a 25-year-old girl,
Yeah.
in a sense, who is exactly the same knowledge level as well. So I think it's important to actually value and understand these kind of things as well. So it's not just about your nationality or everything, but
Yeah.
everybody's more or less equal in that sense.
So how did you cope? How did you manage to acquire your immense wine knowledge?
I think it all comes down to what we were talking about earlier. So it's passion and dedication in that
Yeah.
sense. So if you have the drive, you will find the means.
Yeah.
So
You traveled extensively, I guess.
traveling indeed, but as I said, we have a wide selection there as well. It's just not as deep. So for example, if I want a specific producer, maybe some lesser known regions in that sense, it often requires maybe sourcing something, directly from other places. The cost, for example, I think maybe it goes a little bit up as far as, acquiring the knowledge. In the UK, you can go to a store and have everything there. For example, I might need to order something from the UK or from France or wherever directly just to have that specific thing that I might need. But
It's possible.
it's possible, and in the end,
When there's a will, there's a way.
Exactly, and the world is actually, the world is getting bigger and smaller at the same time, if you understand what I
Yes.
mean, because everything is so nearby, you can grab a plane from anywhere and be in 2 hours in another country and do the tasting and be back by the evening, online shipping, everything works super nicely. So everything's possible. It's just finding the way.
You wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I was still stuck in the diversity discussion, but I think one question would be, did you have support?
There's always support in that field, I would say. If without support and without other people there, it's very difficult, just being this. It's something that you greatly admire. For example, you see these people who are, they're the first in their countries. You can see that with specific African countries, for example. You can see these new sommeliers, for example. There's one guy emerging in one country who is super passionate and driving an industry. So this is something that you really admire in that sense. It's almost impossible me to think that, I would be in an environment where I don't have people and wine surrounding me and just like driving that industry from the start, So yes, to answer your question, I did have quite a lot of support, and there's also inspirations, for example, Raymond Thompsons, who is, from another country, but in terms of most countries, he's like a couple of hours drive away in that sense for me, although he's in a different country. So, and he's always has been a big inspiration, and others around there as well. So, yeah.
But I think to add to that, I think we still have a long way to go to promote more female power in that industry.
Yes.
I would like to be more controversial on that part. I don't think we're doing enough, and I don't think we're making it accessible enough. I also don't think we're talking the right way sometimes, and I don't think we're embracing it enough. And it would be...
When you say not talking the right way?
I think there's probably another language behind, or other ways of perception.
Yes.
I'm not female, but there's a lot of female power around me, and they know better how to engage with each other, and they do it differently, And I think the whole trade needs to look at this more closely, how to integrate it in all of our work to make it more accessible to female sommeliers, to step into the trade, to stay in the trade. There are always private challenges for everyone, but to stay in the trade and to be present there and to continue work in the trade.
Yes.
Right? There's one way to lead you all the way to where you are, or to steps where you are, but then also to be in the trade and to stay in the trade. And I think I would really like to be more controversial on that point. I think we need to look at this more closely, to be honest.
I think what you say is very right, because there's also, it goes back to what both of you were saying, that engagement with the consumer, that, being able in a split second to connect with someone you've never met before, gauge their intentions and try to make them happy. And the fact that women communicate effectively with women. I sometimes go out with a very good friend to fine restaurant, and when he says she's tasting the wine, some people, there's a sort of split hesitation, as in, that can't be right. And I think that's the kind of thing that, another woman would never worry about. So there is still an education to be widened in terms of female access to wine knowledge. What can we do about it? Do you have the solution?
I do hope we only have some answers, but I would like to reach out to everyone who is interested in coming to get to know our countries and our wines. I think this is the strongest bond that we can create, and the strongest asset that we can deliver to bring people to our country, to experience the wines and the regions, have an open dialogue, and to make it accessible for tasting, without being, we elaborated a format where you're not being guided, but where you can actually self-explore, but in a very formal setting. And I think this is, it needs to be executed in a way that everyone feels comfortable without being harassed.
Yeah, man or woman.
Man or woman, it doesn't matter, and we are also embracing each and every country, so whoever wants to come.
So that's at the forefront of your priorities when you build your programs, your promotion program. You want to make sure that as many people as possible can benefit.
Well, the format itself is still limited in seats, but we want to. We do it annually.
Everybody come over.
We do it annually, and there's multiple seats to give, And I just want to say we are embracing this, and we want to embrace this, and we want to.
Are you using quotas?
I'm sorry?
Are you using quotas?
Well, I might.
Officially or unofficially? Sorry, I'm putting you in the hot seat. No, but I think it's a very important element because, I mean, the work you do as well is also about bringing...
But it's interesting, like bringing that up about the work we're doing, and you said something about the language we use and how that can change. I think if we think back to the start of this conversation, everything we've said about what defines a sommelier, passion, knowledge, humanity, and in many ways, obviously, having business skills and knowing about, the non-glamorous back end as well, all of that is completely gender neutral.
Yes.
There is, and to my point about, anyone from any background can become a great sommelier. I think we need to just put forward, I mean, it's not that, I can still remember in my lifetime in competitions, you would get marks for describing a wine as masculine or feminine. So that has changed a lot in recent times. And I think one way we can do it in a really positive way, there are many methods, you mentioned quotas, that's one method. But I think a method which is possibly more sustainable is to just unrelentingly put forward like what matters about being a sommelier in sort of this language which we didn't enter into any gendered language around the role, because what is important about being sommelier and what makes a great sommelier, it doesn't matter whether you are a man or a woman. Those skills can be across either. So I think if we unrelentingly put that forward and unrelentingly show that the things you need, that passion, that humanity, if you have that, you have the capability to do it. It can be quite inspiring in a way, because then it can show that there is not a sort of barrier based upon, whether you're a man or a woman. And then, of course, practically speaking as well, there have to be sort of exemplars and role models who people can look at and say, well, I can relate to them. And the good thing is that is increasing. Is it increasing sort of at the right rate? That's a different discussion, but it is increasing, especially when we look to, the first competition I went to was, I'm using competitions as an emblematic example for an industry which I know is much broader than simply competitions. But first competition I went to was in Athens in 2004, and you look at the number of female sommeliers represented then versus now, it's drastically different. Doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be doing more, but it's going in the right direction. I think it's a question of doubling down on making the profession more accessible and emphasizing that anyone can have the skills that are needed to be a sommelier, no matter where they're from or who they are, would be my view on it.
So entering the profession is one thing. Thriving on the profession, staying in the profession is another one. One of the classic issue for women in work is not just when you start, is how are you going to last if you decide to have a family? And Laure in the UK, well-known sommelier, said to me once that all her social life revolved around other people in hospitality because of the antisocial hours. So how do you, again, very controversial, but can you be a successful sommelier and have children? As a woman? Asking the son of a sommelier.
I mean, and asking a panel of three chaps as well. Probably not the most qualified to answer it. I think, the question, I honestly do not feel qualified to answer about whether that's possible or not, because I'm not in that situation and it's a very distant situation from where I'd be. But what I will say is, should it be possible?
Yes.
That answer is 100% yes. And so if it's not possible, the question is then, why is that not possible and what can we do to remedy that?
Exactly.
And so that's a much broader discussion than the three of us, I think, sat here.
But I would like to add one thing. I think it could also be that the role is not necessarily on the floor, but I see these people slipping into management positions where they're where they're curating lists, where they are educating, where that is more feasible with a family life, and it's not necessarily the floor.
Yeah.
And if it's later on the floor again, that might as well be. But for a certain amount of time, there needs to be other opportunities, and there are other opportunities.
Versatility in the role, yeah. Is that your take on it as well?
I agree in that sense. There are some countries, I don't know how it is in all countries, but at least in Estonia, there is also an opportunity for, paternity leave, for example, not just maternity leave. So, like the father can stay at home. That's completely normal these days as well, at least. So this is something that can be looked at as well. And I would say I would completely agree in that sense. First of all, that it's a very, very broad topic for three guys to discuss upon, and I also agree with you that there are other options, because the role of the sommelier is much more diverse and versatile. That's also what we've been talking about. It's not just about working on the floor; it's much wider.
But here's a question then: say, for example, you have a woman who is a sommelier who has had children, and their passion is working on the floor, and that is what they want to do. I suppose one of the questions is, should that be made more possible? Because there might be many who might not want to transition to the more managerial, the less floor-based role. Because I know, for going back to our conversation about passion, for many somms, being on the floor is the passion, and that interaction is the passion, and it's integral. So that could be sort of a more specific question within this.
Yes, there has to be some flexibility. Staying on the topic of work-life balance, obviously, if you want to learn, if you want to develop that passion, you need to travel. You need to travel to wine-producing countries. You need to travel and eat in restaurants in other countries. How easy is that, and how can organizations like yours support this kind of initiative? And possibly the Gérard Basset Foundation as well. So it's a question for the three of you.
Yeah, I mean, listening to when you describe the sommelier's life and job, it's dense already. But without the experience being made abroad, you couldn't do your job properly. So what we see is, when we try to talk to these people and find time when they could actually come and visit us, they're like, I'm too busy, got work to do. We have very late registrations, and we have very late cancellations. Their jobs are very unpredictable. I think there needs to be some consistency for these people's lives and jobs. That would also make our lives better when we're trying to bring them in to enable them to experience country and wines, to be honest. I mean, this is what we see is our link. We're providing a framework where we are enabling all of this, getting to know winemakers, getting to know regions. By the way, also a lot of female winemakers, by now. Which is fantastic to see. And in this role, we, as an industry, need to make sure that these people's lives are not so dependent on uncertainties, because then we're back to diversity and gender equality. I mean, if you cannot predict your day, you cannot manage it with kids. And we would appreciate it if we could have people actually joining us for the things that we're arranging for hours and days. We're putting a lot of effort in, and love and money, and then that they could actually participate. So. If we can look at this as an industry, that it's important for the sommeliers to do this and to have this, and we're supporting them on their way to their competitions, and we're supporting them on their ways through their jobs, then I think we would make 2 steps forward, to be honest.
So do you think that every single generic organization should have part of its budget dedicated to helping sommeliers?
Of course, there is no other way around. And also, looking back at I had the situation at Austrian Wine, I have the situation at OTW. You always have limited budget, right? Yes. So if you want to have your message being brought across, which is always a complex message, because there's wine laws and etc., you need to have people who are actually able to transfer that message to the people who will then buy and consume wine. And it can only be the sommeliers. To a certain extent, it's also the professional trade, I mean, those who are also providing information. But we could have never focused on the massive stores and just to support that. That's not the way that we could have gone with the budget and time available. So it was always our focus to have the sommeliers on board and to have them come to country. And I think, yes, that is my statement, every generic body and every association should have a program like this.
That's brilliant. Mikk, how useful was that kind of help in your progress?
Definitely useful, because it's not only about offering the means to travel, for example, but it's also for these certain organizations to come to your country to basically bring Austria to Estonia in a small way, for example, or to any other country in that sense. So it's definitely doing a lot. And I also think that traveling is key importance to being a good sommelier as well, because you really need to visit the regions. You need to talk to the winemakers. You need to touch the soil and feel the rain to actually understand the wine region to its fullest. Otherwise, a lot of the regions will remain anonymous or even misunderstood. You haven't been there. You haven't heard the stories. You haven't felt the real thing. It's a huge role.
And how can you help?
Well, we do our best, but I think you've touched upon their time in many ways, like having consistency of time and then travel being essential. Both of those often come back to sort of availability of resources to be able to have those two things. And I think what we try and do with the foundation through our direct scholarships that we offer, but also through the grants we make to sort of partner organizations across the world, is very much trying to ensure that the beneficiaries can, in many cases, gain consistency where there wasn't consistency before. So that then oftentimes, if we're talking, some of our scholarships and some of our grants, which are aimed at people maybe further progressed in the industry, who are sort of looking to maybe enter the competition circuit as a sommelier, then at that point, the nature of our support really is in terms of funding to enable them to go and travel and go and have these experiences and tap into that community. Whether that be in the form of visiting wine regions or, attending an MW seminar, for example. But then at the sort of more beginning entry level to the industry, I think the value of our support can be just giving people time to consider something they maybe haven't had the ability to consider before. Like a lot of the work we do, say in South Africa, a lot of the initiatives we support there, it's not just about sort of helping people from these areas in South Africa visit wine regions around the world, but it's actually sort of showing them, do you know what possibilities there are within the wine industry, how many varied roles there are, and actually there is arguably a role that can appeal to everyone's personality within the wine industry if you know where to look. And I think to our point earlier about demystifying, that's in many ways what we try and do, sort of, especially at that early level, sort of help demystify people. Okay, what is it that you enjoy? What is it you're passionate about? And what is it within our industry that would fit with that? And in the case of a sommelier, though, then definitely we do then provide support for them to be able to travel, for them to be able to get samples, because without that, it's, you're hamstringing them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, if that shows anything, just it's very hard to sort of give one answer to that question for us, because another factor is that every country's circumstances are different in terms of the state of the industry, the state of access to wine, the state of, how progressive it is in terms of having time to study, having time to look after children, having time to have a work-life balance. And so one of our key choices we made with the foundation is to always try and work with local partners, whether they be wine education institutes, whether they be other non-profits, whatever they may be, even other wineries, so long as the program itself is non-profit. What we take the view that we're abundantly aware, most of the team's based in the UK with one team member based in Paris. What do we know about what's most needed in South Africa? We have the resources, but it's essential that we then work with people locally so that that support can be tailored in the best possible way.
Yeah, that's a very good approach. You've mentioned competitions. Competitions have sort of crept up in the conversation. What is the importance of sommelier competition? What role do they play in the career? Are there competition refuseniks in your profession? I'm quite curious about it. Tell us more.
That's a very interesting term.
Yeah, you just think, they are people who tell you they never want to sit another exam in their lives, or why not saying, I just don't want to do competition. I can be brilliant at my job without that. So tell us more, and congratulations again on your big win.
I think it more or less falls in the same category as doing these like competitions, exams. All of that falls kind of in the same category, at least for me. It's all about the self-development for sommelier.
Yeah.
It's a never-ending field in that sense that just keeps on changing. There's basically like never a point in a sommelier's life when you can say that, I'm ready now.
I know everything.
It keeps on going forever, and this is just one of the ways of developing yourself.
Yeah.
Some people don't like the kind of like the pressure or even sometimes the visibility of competitions, for example. They just want to do their own thing in their own path, so competition's definitely not for everybody. But it serves the same means as doing your CMS exams, your WSET, ASI diploma, anything. It falls in the same category for me in that sense. What I can say, what it really does maybe have a little bit of an advantage towards compared to the exams is the community that's around there. Just the ability to meet other sommeliers. At first, of course, international levels, but you can kind of expand that. And if you ever reach the international level, it's the whole world is your oyster. You will make so many important connections worldwide that will help both you develop as a sommelier, sometimes even help your entire country develop in that sense, in that industry, and it will just give that added value. Yeah.
What's your perception about sommelier competition?
I think I was lucky enough to be at most of them for the last 15 years.
Yes.
One thing is, I think it is very important that it is nowadays more reflecting a new reality, that it's been evolving, that it did not get stuck in old perceptions.
What you were saying
what
about
you were
business
saying
questions.
earlier, business questions.
And for example, in the world's best summer in Paris in 2023, in the semi-final, the blind tasting was all non-alcohol or low-alcohol options, for example. So, sorry, demonstrate.
So that is necessary and important. And the second thing is that that these competitions do take place does elevate the trade overall, its perception, also to the outside world. The outside world meaning non-trade people. It's because
Civilians.
It might seem obvious for us. It's not so obvious for many others. So when we, for example, had the European Championship in Vienna, that was also big for us in Vienna and Austria to have the world looking, or the wine world looking at it, and then by this exemplifying towards the outside world and make it so. It is important, It provides to all the areas. It provides more professionalism, and everyone is having his role in there. The media needs to be there. The songs need to be there. The organizations need to be there, and we need to enable it because it costs money.
Yes. What doesn't?
But at the same time, remain independent, obviously. They need to do their job, and those organizations need to do their job. But it needs to work hand in hand that everyone can see the good and positive things about it. And I think it does. And therefore, even though it might not be for everyone, that's, I think, fair enough. But for those who are willing to compete, and we're trying also to support people who are willing to compete. We don't necessarily see enough of them in Austria, for example. It is challenging to show them the way why they should do it, maybe. But we're trying to support them.
They need to speak to Mikk.
They need mentors. They need mentors, and I think just enabling them to get to know mentors like Mikk. Or you mentioned Raymond's, these people are such important figures in the trade that will help people understand why they should go that path. And that's eventually what we hope that people do. We need sommeliers.
And you mentioned something which I think is really important, looking at it from the outside in the sommelier profession, the role of mentoring. Because it strikes me that possibly because there's so much information, so much knowledge to acquire, that a lot of the top sommeliers seem to be incredibly generous with their time. They have themselves benefited from a lot of help. And it seems to be one of these professions where people help each other. They're not sort of in their silo. They are helped on the way up, and once they're there, they give back. Is that, am I just looking at it with rose-tinted glasses, or?
No, I think that's utterly essential. I mean, Dad, if you spoke to him about his sort of journey and in Sommelier, he would be the first person to say that it was only possible thanks to the mentors who he had along the way. And then Dad is a very good example of someone who, you know, there are many sommeliers, many of whom are in the halls down below us right now, who, you know, have known me, for example, since my christening, and who passed through the halls of Duvan and Terravina, and then learned for a time with Papa, were mentored by him, went on to do something else, and then in turn mentored their own mentees. And I think it's something that it can sound quite intangible. It can sound like something that's not guaranteed that people will become mentors, but it is so important and so key to the industry. And in fact, to the point where with one of our scholarship programs with the foundation, we actually have a clause which requires, when the scholars are filling out the application, that if they get the scholarship, they commit to being a mentor to future scholars. Because that also, we've spoken about community and how essential community is. You know, we try with our work to foster that as much as possible and to connect, you know, mentors with mentees, and then in turn, when those mentees are in a position where they can mentor others, to facilitate those connections. Because in my experience, you're dead right. Most of the time, people are very keen to mentor, and I think it's where we can hopefully sort of add value and help is by connecting the best fit of mentors to mentees.
Yes, yeah. What would you say about that? Is that something, have you had a lot of help on the way up? Are you giving back?
Of course, I think what goes around comes around in that sense. So I have definitely received a lot of support and help on my journey, and it's always, even during my journey, you know, we're always, even if it's just doing study groups or this kind of blind tasting sessions or whatever with a community, this is quite integral part, I think. Of course, people have their different ways of, if we're talking about the competitions, which I've gone through so much today already, people have their own set ways. You know, some people like to study on their own, do their own thing in that sense. But I think the idea of mentorship that really helps, especially helps with what we're discussing earlier as well, just like, you know, onboarding people to the industry in that sense, to have these mentor figures and these role models to show that everything's possible in that sense. And it's, as I said earlier as well, it's quite an international community in that sense. So these kind of study groups or mentorships and those things, they work across borders as well. You know, you can have Zoom meetings, study groups in that sense. So all of that works very well. So sommelier, to conclude, huge wine knowledge, dedication, passion. I try to avoid that word since Frances Robinson said she didn't want to hear a wine professional mention passion again, because we all use that word. But still, in your case, that's the best word. Dedication, passion, helping each other, pathfinder, guide. Quite a complex job, but a job that has an amazing future. So long may it continue, with your support and the support of the profession. And let's make it more diverse and more accessible for everybody. Thank you so much for your time on behalf of Vinexposium, for taking time out of your busy schedule. Let's hope you have a fantastic wine Paris and enjoy what's left of the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.